realism, these type of thinkers, and Aristotle in particular, they would kind of assume that time is cyclical, right? Just like you have different seasons, they would assume that you always stay in the present, that there is no deeper change going on, that there's no evolution, right? Things more or less always go through the same cycles, and you can enter that process at any point, right? You just have to kind of wait till things calm down again, and then it starts over. And that's maybe a bit hard for you to understand, but the idea of history as a process, as something where the past is fundamentally different from the future, is a modern idea. People didn't always think of the past as something different. They assumed that the past was kind of like the present, just with different people in it, right? They didn't have this idea of historical evolution, of different eras. Yes, the past is just the memory of the present. But this idea of history, right, changes that. To use a metaphor that I invented, up till this point, until people like Marx and Hegel, most thinkers in political thought, right, have been, let's say, fighting in an arena over who's going to be the boss, right? Like gladiators, you could imagine them. They're just fighting in this pit. Okay, who's going to be the boss? How are we going to do this, etc. And only now they start realizing that this arena that they're in is actually on a ship, and that this ship is moving, right? Suddenly they're like, wait, we're also going somewhere, right? Regardless if I kill you or not, there are bigger processes in motion, right? There's a certain direction that we are heading, that the ship is heading, regardless of what me or you do, right? That's a certain realization of history. That, for example, economics is on its own heading in a certain direction. That demographics, right? That how many children people have, that it actually matters for the future. And that there are certain processes, maybe climate change, right? That there's certain things happening that are bigger than our local drama. That's when people realize that there is something like history, right? History is the ship. I hope you understand my metaphor, right? They suddenly notice that there's a bigger movement going on. And that leads to all new questions, such as, what is happening, right? How does this work? We're on a ship. How does it move? What drives history, right? And very importantly, where are we heading with this? If history is moving, if there is a fundamental difference between 10 years ago and 10 years in the future, and they don't just repeat, then where is this history heading? And am I on the right side of things? Or am I arguing for things that are going against the flow of history, right? Like Rousseau in a way did, and also like Hobbes did. Hobbes was arguing for things that were not exactly in the winning side of authoritarianism, etc. So where is the ship heading? And most importantly, how do we change the direction, right? Besides that, I'm going to try to fight you so my side, my tribe wins versus your tribe. How can we get a grip of these bigger processes? How can we redirect the direction of the economy, for example? Some questions that people didn't really bother asking, right? They were just wondering, how do I make as much money as possible? Not necessarily where is this economy heading? What effects does it have? How do we deal with that, right? So the most important question when you realize that history is a process, that you're on a ship that's going in a certain direction, is, especially if you understand where it's heading, let's say it's heading for disaster, right? Let's say it's heading for climate change. How do we change the course, right? How does this even work? Those are the new questions. And this realization of history, which I assume is a bit hard for you to understand, that people didn't have this thought in the past. This comes with some new requirements for political philosophy, right? First of all, if you want to understand where history is going, you need to understand history as it actually was. If you remember from social contract philosophy, they were all speculating about history, right? They all had their own version of how humans originally lived, but only one of them can be true. Spoiler, it's Rousseau. But this is a factual question. This is anthropological. No, not anthropological. It's a what are these people called again? Archaeological. It's an archaeological question, right? How did people originally live in groups? Were they small communities? Were they individuals? Or were they fighting each other? The answer was small communities. Rousseau wins again. But this matters. It matters what actually happened. You cannot just think in a thought experiment of what if we would start society again, because we're not doing that. We're not starting society again, right? We are not in a history among others. We are in a particular history. So real history matters, and therefore real society matters. It matters how things actually are. You can just think of alternative paths toward us. You can only think about alternative futures. So a lot of the writers that we're going to see next are going to be very skilled in history, and they'll spend a lot of time in figuring out where we're coming from to try to predict the future. Another thing that comes with this is that although you might think that an emphasis on history would lead people to think that, we don't really have control over that destiny, it actually shows that things always change, because the study of history is a study of change, right? So with that comes the idea that, we can change things. We can make a totally different world, right? If we understand it well enough. The idea that progress is possible. And, dear students, there is no event that showed this more clearly to people, that woke people up to the idea that tomorrow can be very different from yesterday, than the French Revolution. So, my lectures on the French Revolution will comprise of 3 parts. We'll see how far I get today, probably only part 1. Part 1 is about history. It's your standard high school history class, but in my enthusiastic voice about what the French Revolution was. Nothing special here. Part 2, I'm going to talk about why this matters and why you should know about it. And in part 3, we're going to go totally off track, and I'm going to have a conversation with you about violence and when and when not political violence could be justified, and if the ends justify the means, right? We're going to talk a lot about that question, what the violence really is, because the French Revolution was quite violent. But for today, I think I'm only going to be able to cover the historical part. So let's dive into that. Or do you have any questions already? No, right? Okay, you're asleep. Nobody's there. All right. I'll be a good YouTuber and keep going anyway. Support me on Patreon. So, if we're going to have historical perspective, we have to first understand why the French Revolution even happened in the first place, right? What led up to this? And we're going to revisit that question also in the next lectures. But what was the situation before the French Revolution? France was one of the stronger countries in Europe, organizationally. It was an absolute monarchy. So it was centralized in a king. And the latest king was Louis XVI. And he basically had all the power. And his government was quite well organized. The problem is that he was an idiot. Louis XVI was not a good king. And the people before him were even worse. So, no, his father was all right, but his grandfather was also a complete idiot. So they both had the unfortunate combination of having a lot of power and not being very good with it, right? They're very egomaniac people. One of his famous quotes is that, I think it's from Louis XIII, that l'état c'est moi, I am the state. So what did he do wrong? Well, the economy of France was not doing very good, and there was more or less the fault directly of the king. Why? Because the king would spend a lot of money on wars that he didn't need to fight, necessarily, right? Wars of conquest or arguing with other kings about, who looks best or whatever. And he picked a lot of fights he couldn't win. So he lost a lot of fights, and that again costs money. And he would just waste a lot of money on himself, on building a bigger palace, right? On entertainment, etc. So the government had high debts, therefore the government had to raise taxes, and that annoyed the rich. But what annoys the rich is not that relevant to us. As Rousseau says, what is not the people is not what we're talking about. So let's talk about the people. People were not doing good under this rule. France was entering this first stage of capitalism, which is horrendous. People kind of transition from having a kind of stable job on the countryside to being permanently exposed to exploitation and unemployment in the cities. And inequality was rising fast, with most people, the vast majority of people, 90% of people, living in absolute misery, hunger, starvation, no health care, bad living conditions. If you want to get an idea of how life was before the French Revolution, you could watch the movie or musical of Les Miserables, which narrates exactly that, how people are miserable. So the people were not doing well, and they were particularly hungry at this time. But we also had some trouble in the philosophical land, because most intellectuals at that time were reading authors who were all questioning how things were. They all came with new ideas, these Enlightenment philosophers, people like Montesquieu, like Voltaire, Turgot, and of course the main man, Rousseau, who died just a few years before the French Revolution. So they came with these ideas like equal rights, right, going against feudalism, freedom of religion, Rousseau's idea of the general will, and in general, just this idea that we must change things to advance. So the rich were annoyed, the poor were annoyed, and the minds were getting filled with ideas of change. And worst of all for the king is that his elite was divided, because within the upper class, you had the tension between the new bourgeoisie, capitalists, the new rich, who had money but didn't have any political power. And you had, on the other hand, you had the church and the aristocracy, who were getting increasingly poor, but they held on to their privileges and access to government. And these would get jealous of each other, and that would spark. How did it exactly start? You might already know, took history in high school, but I'm still going to repeat it, right? Again, none of this is, this is just to give you background. The real important stuff is why this is relevant rather than what happened. But anyway, the French Revolution, dear students, started in 1789. Now you know it for the next quiz or a game program you might take part in. So in 1789, the French Revolution started. And why did it start? Well, okay, let me first say this. There are two waves in the French Revolution. You have the first revolution, which I'll call the Fifi Revolution, and then you had the real revolution, where it's the kind of the working class part of it. Let's first talk about the Fifi part of the revolution. So, or the bourgeois part. This started when the king wanted to raise taxes again, but he didn't really just dare to do it outright. He first wanted to ask permission from the elite. So he gathered what is called the État Général, or it's something like a parliament, except that the parliament only meets when the king wants it to. So it's not a permanent organ, it's basically an advisory council to the king that he can summon. Usually doesn't, but every 10 years or so he'll call these people together. And in them are the three estates of the elite. You had the church, you had the nobility, and then you had other important people, rich people, academics, etc. Don't quote me on it, but roughly it was like 80% for the church, 40% church, 40% nobility, and then the rest at, let's say, 20% or maybe less. Now the rest, the bourgeoisie, they didn't like this proposal. and they were kind of affronted that they couldn't win the vote because the church and nobility were siding with the king. But they said, but we're more important. First of all, there's way more of us than there is of you. And we represent our people, we represent our universities, our workers, our companies, and we're not being listened to. So they revolted. They marched out of the Estado General and they decided to create a national assembly, a new parliament. And that assembly, basically a gathering of important people, both culturally or financially important, they would create a new constitution. They would reshape how the kingdom would work. And this founding is called the Oath of the Tennis Court, 20th June, 89. I mentioned this because I thought it's the Fifi part, right? The Oath of the Tennis Court. Take a moment to appreciate this. No working class revolution starts on the tennis court, right? It's like the oath of the golf court. This matters, right? It tells you something about who was exactly there. So it was an elite revolution, but they had more support because a lot of the workers were also tired of the king being decadent. Plus they worked for these people, so they had a kind of direct line of communication, and also the students were on their side. And basically every intellectual in Paris was on their side. So it was not just the elite, it was the elite and most of their sympathizers. Now the army wouldn't have this. The king said, oh, I'm just going to send the army to crush them. But it wasn't that easy. They started large-scale riots. The little picture you see at the top is the siege of La Bastille. La Bastille is a prison. So they broke open a prison of political prisoners that kind of entered more madmen into the streets. And that's when the revolution actually started. First in Paris and then the rest of the country. It was quite a big battle because it was not that the nobility had no support. Most of the farmers took their side, most of the workers took the side of the bourgeoisie. So they clashed, the rebels won, and 2 months later, by August 89, they changed the law. They abolished feudalism as a legal system. They abolished the idea that people were legally different. They gave equal rights, political rights, like freedom and property, etc., to all people. Oh, all men. So that was a big step forward, right? This is the end of an era. It ended this legal system of inequality that we've had for the past 1,500 years. And they encoded this in the new law in 26th of August, which is the Déclaration de l'homme et du citoyen, or the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was sort of a first formulation of human rights, actually, but then only for French citizens. And thus they changed how things worked. They changed France into a constitutional monarchy, which means that the king stayed, right? That's why it was not that big of a fight, right? They were just fighting over power. This was not a fight of survival. But the middle class got a lot more representatives in the parliament, which became a permanent institution. So things more or less became the way that John Locke wanted them to be, right? They kind of installed his social contract, where you have a king who has the executive power, but you also have the rest of the elite who are represented in a parliament, and people have these basic rights that Locke also talked about. But this didn't really change life for most people. This was cool for people like Locke and his followers. But for the average person, right, they told them, hey, you now have the right to buy land from the aristocracy. And people are like, great, I'll buy as much land as I can with my 2 pesos, right? So for most people, this didn't change anything. They were still dying of hunger. It just, they now had the right to life, but they were still dying. So history didn't end here. Now comes the second part of the revolution, right? There's a kind of simulation The second was not. The second part was when things got real, really real. This was the real uprising of the, again, part of the bourgeoisie, let's say the lower part, so the upper middle class, the intellectuals, and this time much larger containment of the working class. And they actually overthrew the government completely this time, 2 years later in 1792. And they installed some sort of democracy. They installed, instead of this parliament, they installed a convention, which was semi-democratic in the sense that to be in the convention, you couldn't just be anyone. You need to have certain credentials. You needed to have certain education or money, or you needed to be important one way or the other. But everybody, all men, could vote for people to be in there, right? So the people in Paris, they did get to vote, and thus you had a sort of parliament, and they had all power. They were not just legislative power, they were also the government. And the biggest faction in this parliament was the Jacobin faction, which was the left. So the radical left, for the first time, took power. First time in history, right? You had left thinkers before that, but never left people in power. And they were very thorough in what they did. They were very violent. So they declared French Republic. This time they actually got rid of the king. There was no more permanent leader. They ended aristocratic rule, and they killed the king to make sure that his divine bloodline would stop. They did this nice and humiliating. They first dethroned the king, and then they chopped his head off. So, or did they hang him? I think they chopped his head off. So they first said, okay, you're now King Louis XVI. Now you're not king anymore. Now you're citizen Louis, and now we condemn you to death. And that's what they did 1 year later. Matter of fact, they went all the way. They tried to simply eliminate the aristocracy. They tried to get rid of all of them. They were trying to commit a sort of genocide against the old elite. They would systematically track them down and chop their head off. Not in a back alley, but publicly, right? They would hunt down all these barons for good reasons, in a sense, because they were trying to resist them. There was still a civil war going on. But every time they would get one, they would get a duke, they would drag him to the central square. People would come, people would cheer, yay, off with his head. And they would chop his head off with the guillotine. So there was a lot of blood that was flowing in these times. And they got a progressive government, a very successful government, actually. But the revolution would come to an end. So what started the end of this movement, right? France was successful. These left-wing rulers did a good job overall. They got the people on their side. It was less poverty, etc., etc. Except that they themselves in a war with everyone. Why? Because aristocracy is based on family ties, right? It's based on bloodlines. So if you kill all aristocracy, that means that you're killing the brothers, the daughters, and the cousins of the leaders of all other countries, right? Because they're family of each other. So all other countries went into a hysteria over what's happening in France, and they, in turn, all start to declare war on France. Wars that France actually won in most cases. Because again, this new government was very powerful and very proficient in what they were doing. So they drafted armies, they would go to war, they would win almost all of these wars, fought by General Napoleon. General Napoleon, you might have heard of this man. So this went all good, except that this costed buckets of money, right? Keeping all these wars going. Even if you would win, it would still cost you enormous resources. And since they were a populist government, they needed those resources to, well, to feed the poor, right? To satisfy their own people. So things became increasingly difficult. The Republic survived, but it got harder and harder. And the leadership was in constant chaos because there was a lot of violence, a lot of executions, right? Which creates paranoia, because if I could eliminate the old elite, then maybe they're gonna try to eliminate me too, right? There's this constant fear of backstabbing, and there was constant drama amongst the elite. They did backstab the leaders, literally. They stabbed the leader of the left to death on his desk. So the leadership was a bit in disarray, and then in 1795 they ended democracy. The conservatives took over. They shanked the radicals, and they ended democracy. And they themselves, their little group, took over, and they themselves got overthrown 4 years later by General Napoleon, who said, "Enough with this chaos. I'm taking charge. I'm the man here." So he did the military coup, and he ended the revolution because he became the emperor. And if you remember, the French Revolution was against things like king. So with Napoleon, basically monarchy was restored, and he and his family then became the new bloodline. The problem here is that, well, it became a dictatorship, so it ended revolution. However, some things stayed the same. Napoleon was a good leader. He was not a bad dictator. He was a progressive dictator. He modernized France. He did a lot of improvements, also for ordinary people. He was not Fifi himself, but it did end this wave of change, right? So that is the French Revolution, dear students. Now, you might wonder, why does any of this matter? Right? Why do I have to listen to this story about what happened in France 300 years ago? Right? And then it seems like it even failed because Napoleon took over again. Why is this relevant? I won't be able to answer all of that because I don't have the time, but maybe I can get started. Unless, let me first ask this. Do you have any questions about the historical part? Maybe it's a teacher. This is nonsense. I read a book about this. That's not what happened. Need some kind of awkward elevator music for these moments. Miranda Mohammed has no questions. Okay, then I assume that the rest of you are awake as well. Although I doubt it. Okay, then I'll use the last 10 minutes. Okay, wait, Sophia. They were divided. Some people they tried to get rid of Napoleon. They tried to ban him. I think they imprisoned him on Corsica, but he always came back. he was a bit like El Chapo. Like you couldn't really get rid of him. So he would always break out of prison. Then, since he was such a good leader, people would naturally kind of be drawn to him. So he'd then start this new army. He was so good at fighting, he would then win again. So they tried to resist him, but he was too good at the end of the day. And he died at some point in these many wars that he was fighting for France, I think, yes. So at some point he got defeated and kind of this French Republic collapsed. But then his family took over later, and he had the second Napoleon, he had a third Napoleon after him, which was, I think, his cousin. So this continued. So some people resisted Napoleon, but not successfully. And he was genuinely popular amongst, I would say, the majority. So in the last 10 minutes, I won't be able to explain you all of this, but I explain you one of my slides. There's 3 reasons why you should care about this, why this is relevant. Right? The first big lesson of the French Revolution and why it changed the world, because it proved that total change is possible. Right? It proved that society and thus history are malleable, that things are not meant to be a certain way, that humans do not have to live in a society, but that they can actually change it. It reinforced the idea that we, the people, if we would act together as a group, which they never did in history, can actually change everything. You can overthrow your government, you can start a new state, you can take on the whole of Europe and win in this fight as long as you act coordinated. That's what the French Revolution proved. It also proved that the idea of natural leaders and natural law and natural this or that is bullshit. There is no natural. We are not conditioned, as Hobbes would think, by our mind, that we mechanically work and we can only live in a certain way because it was to accept this leadership of some dictator. Apparently not. Apparently you could chop the head of this natural leader and he was not that natural anymore. He died as good as a non-natural leader. So apparently there was no natural order. You could change things. In the end, the revolution got defeated. So you could say, yeah, but it changed back. But long term, the revolution would win because you had other later revolutions that would then restore again the republic. And it's like after this comes 200 years of drama of basically the fight between revolutionaries and the conservatives, and long term the revolutionaries would win. I thought, yes, it brought hope for the world, at least hope for the people who were not happy with how things were. Right? It brought a lot of fear for the leadership. Because it's like in if you ever seen 300, this old movie about the Greeks, they also thought that the emperor was God until he gets cut by a spear, and suddenly you see he bleeds like any human, right? That's what they kind of proved. The king was like, "You can do this," and they were like, "Oh yes, we can." Check, and they just stabbed him. So. Yeah. But he did also escape from that island at least once. But I guess in the end he died there too. Okay, so history could change, right? Now what changed? One of the things that changed is that it reintroduced the idea of a republic. That means a state without a permanent leadership, a state without a bloodline, right? It was the beginning of the end of monarchies. As you have yourself explained to me, not all monarchies are dead, right? There are still about 18 monarchies left in the world. But this was, let's say, the tipping point. Things were never going to get better for monarchies either after the French Revolution, right? It showed that we didn't need them. It ended feudalism. It ended this whole system of leasing to people and this whole system of power based on land and all of that. And replaced it with this idea of citizen rights. And that's really important. The concept of a citizen, the concept that you have a kind of natural relationship to your country that gives you rights over that. Yeah, I was wrong. He got defeated in combat. He didn't die there. That's true. So the French Revolution kind of solidifies the idea that the people mattered, right? That citizens matter to politics. And it changed the world forever in the sense that any future political project, any future ideology of thinker had to take the people into account. They had to base their argument, or at least pretend to base their argument, on how this was somehow going to be good for the population. That doesn't mean they had to be Democrats. A lot of the ideologies we're going to see are not democratic. That's not the point. It means that they have to at least address the people, right? Even Hitler, who was a dictator, he still needed to give speeches, right? He cared what people thought. He spent a lot of effort on propaganda and television to make people, they couldn't vote, but he still wanted to base his rule on some type of, maybe not agreement, but at least understanding with the population, right? Same for people like Stalin, who are not Democrats, but they did spend a lot of effort on trying to shape public opinion, right? So any future ideology had to take citizens into account, democratic or not, doesn't matter. You cannot just, like Machiavelli, write a book to the king, right? And then that should somehow be enough. And with this came also the introduction of a new set of political values that would get introduced. World values such as liberty and equality that have been written about before, right, by Locke and Rousseau, but also new values, values like brotherhood, right? These are the three values of the French Revolution: liberté, égalité, et fraternité. And fraternité, or brotherhood, is a new value. The idea that we're not just equal, you and me, we're somehow related, right? We should look after each other. We should, as a society, be in solidarity. This whole idea of solidarity and sticking up for each other, that got introduced as a main value. They were very serious about this. And with this come all kind of new political concepts that you had before maybe on paper, but now they got actually introduced. Things like freedom of religion. France didn't go back to state religion afterwards. Also things that you might not think of that come with citizen rights. For example, divorce. Divorce used to be the main of the church, right? You cannot really divorce in the church. You can get your marriage annulled. But anyway, that would be a religious procedure. With citizen rights comes the right to divorce, which is really important right for a lot of people, right? Because before that, you had to you were doomed to be with this idiot or this abusive wife of yours forever, or you would burn in hell. That changed. That matters to people. Other civil rights, protection for minorities, etc. So the world definitely changed, and it showed people that change was possible. And I don't have time to go to the next one, but that's it for today. Next time, I'm going to tell you more reasons. We're going to talk about the left, the original left, and we're going to talk about how this had ripple effects in the rest of the world. And we're going to talk about violence. All right. Do you have any questions for me, dear students, or remarks, or other things? Napoleon was, at the time that the Jacobins had the power, Napoleon was not a politician, he was a soldier. So Napoleon was a soldier in the army of the Jacobins. But there's no such thing as supporting him because he wasn't, he was a general in the army. But Napoleon, roughly, you could, like on an economic scale, you could categorize him a bit on the left. Although he wanted to be the emperor, so he definitely had some aristocratic ambitions. He went a bit crazy near the end. But that was not the main beef. The Jacobins were dead by the time that Napoleon came around. Well, not all of them were dead, but the important figures were dead by the time he rose to power. It all happened very quickly. It's a revolution. Yes, so brotherhood adds to it, right? Is this idea of belonging, but with that comes a group identity. And with a group identity also comes the notion that you can be a traitor, right? Like, we're family, and if you then do something wrong against us, then you're kind of breaking with the group. So yeah, it became more rooted in national identity. There's the idea that the French people were not just different classes that kind of had to tolerate each other, a way in which I think Mexico still identifies as like different groups that kind of hate each other, but we have to live together. It became more this idea of we, the French, us against the world, right? That kind of mentality, because that's what it was. France was fighting against everyone. Now, the idea of a nation is older. France was already a nation in an organizational sense, but it got realized. Let's say the idea was already there. Machiavelli had the idea of a nation. Dante had an idea of a nation. But here it got a big boost. For example, France had this very big citizen army, right? Of just whoever wanted to join the army, they could. You didn't have to have any relations to a duke or a baron or a knight. So they did a lot of things together. So yeah, in a sense, this amongst many other processes helped boost the idea of a nation. But there are many other things. We're going to see later with Hegel too. It also has to do with culture, etc., etc. All right, then I'll stop it here. And next time I'll go on with the French Revolution. All right, dear students, I'll let you go, and much luck. Let me first take attendance. Don't leave me yet. Good luck with whatever exam you're studying for. And that's it. All right. See you next time for more French Revolution. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you, doctor.